Hey y'all, it's Region 4 Outreach and Communications Coordinator Matt Cameron, and today I'm in Roan Mountain, Tennessee with retired Executive Director Ed Carter, and we're going to talk about conservation funding. Now you've spent, let me see if I get this right, 48 years working for the TWRA?
I was in my 49th when I finally retired, but just barely. That's
quite a career in any field, but for a wildlife career, you've seen a lot from the days of the Game and Fish Commission to where we're at today, and things are markedly different. I know we don't have time to go down all those paths, but what was your first position with the agency, and then tell us how you ended up as being director?
Well, my first one was, the title was called Education Representative, but what it really meant was putting on fair exhibits all over the state. At that time, the agency went to all the major fairs, and we had wild animals that we would build a different set for on each one of the fair exhibits, and that's what we did mostly. And then from there, kind of moved in pretty quickly into hunter education, and then the hunter education kept me busy there for about 2 years, and then moved into the law enforcement division, then out of that into the Region 2 office and stayed there for 7 years, and out of that into chief of boating and stayed there for 19, and then into the director's office for 11.
When I heard on you were the chief of boating, and when Gary Myers retired, when was that about?
Well, I started in 2009 as director. So
okay.
He actually left, I guess, the 1st of February in 2009, and I started March 1st.
Okay. All right, so Gary's director, and your director now. We have Bobby Wilson, and Bobby was your assistant for a while.
He was, former chief of fisheries, and we worked together in one way or another for, gosh, 30-something years. And then, yeah, his last few years, he was the assistant director.
I don't think a lot of our people at the field level understand just what it takes to fund wildlife conservation and management in Tennessee. And we're set up a little bit differently than other states. So can you talk to us about the importance of why it's necessary to purchase licenses to fund conservation and management?
You know, many people I run into, they'll continually say something, well, my tax dollars do this, and I say, you know, we don't get those tax dollars. We really are not a general fund agency, which means we don't get the general fund money that comes from all the sales tax that go into the coffers across Tennessee. So we do have the Wetlands Fund, which is a separate tax altogether on real estate, and we do get some help out of that. But other than that, if it weren't for the federal aid money that we get back from different excise taxes on the federal level, we would really be hurting, because the only thing we have to match that in many cases is our license dollars. So since 1949, when the agency was formed, as it is similar to today, the license dollars is what kept us afloat. So we have to be really judicial. We're different than a lot of other state agencies in that at the end of the fiscal year, which starts July the 1st here in Tennessee, the other state agencies pretty much get the same amount of money they had the year before if funding's available. Mm-hmm. We don't. We get whatever we've been able to raise and whatever we've been able to bring forward from the year before. So having all those tied together is what keeps us moving, and that's why license sales are so important to us.
Okay, and on the boating end of things, boat registrations help fund the boating division and enforcement. Is that correct?
It is, and as a quick disclaimer, I guess in some ways, the federal aid money that comes in, except for boating, cannot be used for law enforcement. So everything else that does go on in law enforcement, it's paid for out of license dollars. The only exception is in boating, and that doesn't come through those other federal aid programs. It comes by way of the Coast Guard, and that money can be used for enforcement. But it's boat registrations and federal aid, and that's what funds the boating program.
Okay, and this federal aid, there's different acts that have been passed throughout history that appropriates money to us based on the number of hunters and anglers we have. Is that kind of how it works?
You know, you'd really have to go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. And when he came in as president in 1901, he kind of started the conservation movement, set up the first wildlife refuges. Over his tenure as president, he set up 50 different wildlife refuges. Then you have the National Forest Service and all those other things that he was integral in putting together. So in 1937, they finally got around to saying we need some funding for wildlife, because wildlife was going down the tubes. There was no money available for the most part for wildlife agencies to function on other than what license dollars they could bring in, and most of that was really not a lot of money in most states. So on the federal level, they were trying to figure out how do we keep these wildlife refuges afloat. So they started funding those out of some of the federal funds, different than the ones we get. But anyway, without going into all the minute details, in 1937, they took a tax that had been around since 1919, and that was an excise tax on firearms and ammunition, on long guns and ammunition. So they diverted that. Congress made a special act, and we call it Pittman-Robertson. It's wildlife restoration funds, and it diverted that money to wildlife agencies by way of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on a matching basis. So that has been one of the huge big things that has kept us afloat for years. Then later on in 1950, they did the same thing for fisheries. Then in 1980, I think it was, Wallop Bro came in, which amended all the fishery side and also put some money in for boating. And then they went back and redid the Pittman-Robertson side to bring in a tax on handguns and archery equipment. And those two things are what funds hunter education programs and shooting ranges.
Okay, that's a pretty good bit of history in a nutshell.
It's probably a bigger nutshell than you wanted to hear, but
No.
There's a lot of detail that goes into how all those things happen.
So Ed, I get this a lot from the public that our licenses cost more than other states, and we've done all sorts of comparisons with surrounding states, and in some cases that's true. Can you explain why that is? Help folks understand that.
Comparing license prices is really difficult. You would seem so easy. You just look at what they charge here, but you get into the details of it. In Tennessee, you buy a combination license. We're the only state in the southeast now that does that. So if you buy our license, you can hunt and fish. In the other states, you have to buy a hunting license and then a fishing license. And then if you buy a hunting license, here if you buy like a sportsman's license, you can take as many deer as the limits will allow. In those other states, a lot of them, okay, you get your first deer, then you have to buy another tag for the second deer, another tag for the third deer. So it's really difficult to start comparing prices, and you have to break it down little by little. But you are right, in some cases we are higher than some of the other states, but you have to look also that almost every state in the southeast receives general funds to their wildlife agency to help augment their financial program.
I think that's the biggest difference. And folks don't know that we're, like you said before, pretty much completely self-funded by license sales, boat registrations, and then the federal kickbacks. We don't get that general fund money. And why is that a benefit that we don't get general tax money? Has there ever been a push for the agency to get that?
We've talked about it before, and it sounds like we're going to pat ourselves on the back here, but we've been so efficient with what dollars we get that the rest of the state agencies need money as well to keep functioning. And so when it gets down to, they're going, well, y'all are doing okay, so we'll help you where we can, but for right now we're not going to go the general fund route. But they did make some exceptions. Like I said, the wetlands fund has been a huge thing for us, and able us to buy some wetlands across the state, but also now it's allowing us to help on wildlife management areas and things that we couldn't do in the past. So again, when we pair that up with the federal money, every time you do that, you take $3 and it becomes $4, or you take $1 and it becomes $4, depending on which way you do it. So it's a great help.
Before you and I got started, we briefly discussed lifetime sportsman licenses, and I don't know how long those have been in effect. You may recall, but tell us how those work and how the agency makes money off of them. I know that for a young child, it's very, very inexpensive. It's very attractive, but for people that are middle-aged, it's very expensive. So how does the sportsman license work?
There were one or two states, maybe more than that, but when we started looking at it, and it was an initiative that grew out of the wildlife division, saying, hey, let's consider this. The idea behind it, at the time, interest rates were 12%. So if you had money in the bank, you were drawing 12% interest. You had to pay 12% on houses and things too, but you're drawing 12% interest. So it said, if we can get somebody to buy a license when they're young, and we can count it every year, that way the federal aid side of things, you have to have a paid license before you can draw down federal dollars. So if we can have that every year, that person, we'll be able to count them every year as a hunter or as a fisherman, and that will aid our federal aid side. But at the same time, the money will go into the bank. We'll get 12% interest off of it, and over time, that 12% of a few $1 million will bring in more money than if that person bought a license this year, they didn't buy it the next year, or they waited 3 years before they bought it. That churn, as they call it, where people drop in and drop out.
Right.
You lose not only the state side, but the federal side as well. So the idea was it would be a long-term funding solution, and it would be able to utilize the interest off of that to fund wildlife programs. It wasn't too long after that till the interest rate fell out. And so now there's a huge discussion on, are we really making money off of lifetime licenses, or are we losing money? And I know we're looking at that. I still say we all the time, but we're looking at that to try to determine what can we do. I look at some of the other states around us, and they've had a lifetime license for long enough that their cash flow every year now is really starting to be in a critical spot, because they don't get that constant money coming in. They're not getting money off interest. So long story short, it's supposed to be a program that a person's, once they come in, you get the federal aid money every year, and you can also keep that churn going in a positive direction, and the interest off of that money every year will build. Just hasn't worked out that way on the interest side. The rest of it's still true.
You know, it is somewhat costly to purchase a license. You know, if you compare that to what gear costs, to me it's irrelevant. You know, we spend so much money on firearms and fishing tackle and boats and all that. You know, a license purchase is very inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, but to purchase a license does so much for managing fish and wildlife so that we have them for generations to come, because it hasn't always been that way.
You know, as I mentioned earlier, back in the early 1900s, wildlife was on the brink of disaster. Deer populations were down, wild turkey were just unheard of in most places, and a lot of that was because of commercial activities that was unregulated, and on and on. So it began to take a real toll. So as those things were noticed and the funding started becoming available, people started really working passionately about restoring wildlife. In the first part of my career, we were moving deer and relocating deer to areas that didn't have any. I never saw a deer in the wild until I went to work for the agency. So anyway,
we relocated. You can't go a mile down the road without seeing a deer.
You know, they run by the cabin every day.
Yeah.
And so do the turkeys. But in any case, as we begin to do that, we're in the restoration phase, and that lasted for several years. And now the transition is to managing that wildlife. We're not so much in the restoration as we are maintenance side now, with the exception of disease management. And every time that something comes in, whether it's whirling disease in trout or CWD in deer, or you name it, those are things that really can knock a wildlife population down, and has to really be managed appropriately by people with that knowledge and the right scientific background to be able to put the right regulations and right management tools in place. But so we went from having almost nothing to really great restoration, and now populations are impacted by a lot of habitat loss. So we're trying to figure out over time, what's that habitat loss going to do to wildlife populations? Will it do essentially the same thing that that under-regulation did back in the early 1900s? And that's another thing we could talk about forever, but that's why public land is so important. And that when we can, and where it makes sense, not buying everything that comes available, but when we have something that makes sense to buy for a wildlife reason, a town to another wildlife management area, protect a particularly critical area, that land will be there for the public, and it will not be impacted by habitat loss. And that's going to be critical. 50 years from now, I think people are going to say, boy, that's really great that we have this public land.
Amen. Yep. You know, right here on the border of the Cherokee National Forest, which is several thousand acres. I have no idea how big it is.
It's our largest one in the state. It literally runs the entire length of the eastern border of our state.
And your property backs up right next to it here.
It does. That's a great thing.
Just a beautiful place, and I'm just thankful to be here. Appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
It's been kind of a walk down memory lane here in a lot of ways, and I appreciate the opportunity, Matt.
Thanks for coming on the show, Ed. We're in the pandemic, so we won't shake hands and all that. But,
no hugging for sure.
So I appreciate you, and stay in touch, and we'll do this again sometime. If you got anything else here we want to talk about.
Sounds great to me. I look forward to that.
All right, guys. Well, thanks to Ed here's 48-year career in the agency. That's longer than I've been alive. No gut punch.
You had to bring that up.
Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Drop the Tailgate. Tune in next time for some more fun in the Tennessee Great Outdoors.